Now, for those of you that like to soak up all kinds of financial and economic knowledge like I do, you might listen to a famous little publication by NPR called Marketplace.
This is Marketplace.
It's an enjoyable little podcast led by Kai Risdall that basically looks into all kinds of segment of the economy. However, it is controlled and ran by NPR, and we all know they are a bit of a left-leaning organization. Now, typically, I stay very nonpartisan because I see pros and cons of both sides and try to hash out the truth in the middle. But the other day, I believe the air date was the 16th, so yesterday for me, they had a program on there titled "The Federal Budget is Not the Same as a Household Budget." And they basically went through great lengths to convince their listeners that the argument that Kevin McCarthy and many other Republicans of the House are making in regards to why we should not continue to spend beyond our means, why we should not continue to issue and raise the debt ceiling. The argument here is that they are actually the problem, that this faction of the government, the Republican Party, is actually the reason why our government may have to start paying higher interest rates and may even default on our debt. Not the fact that we are spending, deficit spending, and going into debt in the first place. And they gave many reasons, which I'm going to address in this video, as to why they felt that way and how the argument that this is the same as a credit card or a household budget is almost, they made it seem like it was just silly to even compare the two. And to be honest, I'm quite disappointed in Kai Risdall. I'm quite disappointed in Marketplace because even though I do expect a somewhat left-leaning viewpoint on most politics, this is economics at its core, and the fact that they are trying to take advantage of people's understanding of economics by basically just being blatantly false and partisan, I take great exception to, and so of course I hopped on here. So I'm going to make sure I put up a link, or at least put up the web address in this video for that podcast so that you know exactly what these people are trying to do. The first argument they gave here was the fact that the federal government has obligations that they just cannot wait on. So they talked about employees, federal employees that have to be paid salaries. They talked about national security, which has to be paid for. They talked about Social Security and Medicare. They talked about all the obligations that the federal government must spend money on. And effectively, they were saying that most households don't have such obligations, which is just patently false, right? I mean, we're talking about a scale, right? So yes, most households don't have the same obligation as the scale of payments necessary to fund the federal government, to fund the largest, most powerful economy in the world. But most households do have guaranteed or minimum payments that they have to pay once a month, if not yearly, for certain things like insurance, mortgages, utilities, right? I mean, there is a large portion of payments that households have to budget for that's going to be paid for. Otherwise, they'll be homeless and bankrupt, something that the federal government doesn't have to worry about. So like most of these arguments, I didn't really understand how the idea that they have expenses that can't wait is a reason why it's not a good comparison to compare to a household budget. Households also have expenses that can't wait, and what most households do will adjust or only expend, if they're responsible, only expend what some proportion or what they make exactly. They are not going, most households are not going to spend beyond means and set themselves up in positions where their mortgages and utilities far outweigh their income, because usually they can't get approved for transactions like that anyways. The next great argument they put together was that the U.S. is not actually going to be in danger of having a bad credit score unless the Republican Party wins this little standoff they're having with not wanting to raise the debt ceiling, right? So again, the Republican Party is the only thing standing in the way from having any sort of negative effects of spending and deficit spending and going into debt. So essentially what they're saying is that most Americans, most households can't just continue to go into debt, can't just continue to run up credit card bills and pay for things on credit, because eventually they will stop being awarded lines of credit. The credit card companies will stop extending those lines of credit, and their credit rating will go down because they've used up so much credit that their credit to cash ratio is going to be out of whack. Again, something the federal government doesn't have to worry about, but that is only because the federal government is the world reserve currency. That's not a positive. That's not a reason to continue to spend the way they are. Because very much so, like they alluded to, if we do reach the debt ceiling, if we do end up having a fight over raising the debt ceiling, we very much will default. And then we will start to see a lowered credit rating, which will make all debt currently issued that much more expensive and new debt that much harder to achieve. The next great reason was income sources are different. So they compared the fact that most households make yearly salaries or are living check to check, wages from jobs, versus the government's power to collect massive tax revenue and the power to demand more tax revenue. And so because the government has this power to demand more tax revenue, it's not the same as a paycheck or a salary, because essentially you have far less negotiating power when it comes to the income that you can make. So again, somehow this is a reason as to why the debt ceiling should continue to be risen and we should continue to deficit spend, because the federal government has the power to collect more taxes. And I just don't understand how they don't understand that. That's actually the problem, is that they have this power to collect tax revenue. And that is how we are supposed to fund all of these transactions. And yet they're not doing it. They're not properly doing it. The tax revenue that they are collecting is falling far short of what we are actually spending. So the idea that the tax revenue, the power to collect taxes, is a reason to not be concerned about spending into debt is just absurd. If the federal government wants to spend the way they want to spend, then they need to raise taxes, which I submit to you, most Americans probably don't want them to spend the way they are continuing to want to spend, and therefore probably won't want tax revenue and taxes to go up. But that is what should happen if they were fiscally responsible. And then they also mentioned the government's ability to issue bonds. That is how effectively we actually go into debt, is by allowing other countries to buy our bonds. And the bonds are always in demand because America is thought to be relatively safe. Again, the idea of world reserve currency. So the fact that we are able to issue bonds apparently, again, is another reason why this is in no comparison to a household spending on credit and going into debt, because America can issue bonds, and therefore it's not the same. I just don't understand any of these arguments. It very much so is the same. As a household, you would not want to spend more than you take in, whether what you're taking in is a paycheck or a salary versus tax revenue. Regardless of the scenario, you're not going to want to take in more than you're not going to want to spend more than what you take in. The fact that the government can continue to go into debt, continue to spend on credit, and they don't have to worry about their credit score taking a hit, is not a reason to not be concerned, and not a reason to think that it's still not the same as if a household were to do that. The only difference is a household can't do that for very good reason. A household shouldn't be allowed to do that, because obviously it would be disastrous for that family or for that situation. You would be totally bankrupt, and you would owe creditors a lot of money. It's already starting to happen. Do not let these people somehow convince you that demanding fiscal responsibility is actually the reason why we're about to possibly default on our debt. And the natural right thing to do here is to raise the debt. Do not let these people convince you that that is what is normal and that is what should be done, when you're sitting here trying to make sense of it in your own mind and saying, hey, within my life, I can't act the same. So why would I say that not only is it okay for the federal government to act the same with my tax revenue, but also they should? It's actually irresponsible for anybody to expect or demand less. That is ridiculous. That is completely just fiscally irresponsible. And the fact that a major publication like NPR is promoting an episode like that is just a shame. But such is the times we live in. Until next time, everybody, Backseat Economist out.